Welcome back, everyone. This is the third lecture of this course. And similar to the previous two lectures, the purpose of this lecture is to give sort of a very general overview of some of the major concepts that we're going to be delving deeper into as we progress into this course about domestic violence. As I've mentioned before, all of these are sort of designed, these first three lectures are sort of like broad brushstrokes, sort of to give you a general idea of like sort of the umbrella that we're going to be working under. What is domestic violence? What are the categories? What are some of the major considerations that we need to talk about? And in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about, introduce you to how domestic violence is reported or when it fails to be reported, how it's responded to by law enforcement. And then also another one of these sort of like gold terms that we want to make sure we become familiar with is sort of this notion of context-specific definitions, which will help us, I think, to understand the nuances of domestic violence from location to location, case to case, etc. So that's kind of where we're going to be walking through with this one. The readings that go along are Chapter 2, and I know Chapter 2 has been mentioned previously, but with many of these lectures, we kind of sort of hit on or re-hit certain key areas of the chapters. So let's go ahead and get started. So we start off with, well, we know that domestic violence is out there, and we've started to see it with some of our initial lectures and some of our initial reports and readings. But how much of it actually gets reported? Does all the domestic violence that occurs in the United States or in the world get reported? Of course not, and we know that. But we would like to get an idea of, in order to measure the amount of it and the nature of the problem, we'd like to have an idea to quantify the amount that is actually reported versus the amount that might actually be occurring. So what we see here are, I have sort of like 3 bullet points on this slide that sort of hit on and show you, just with a very, once again, broad brushstrokes, give you an idea of the variety of responses you get when you ask the simple question, well, how much domestic violence actually gets reported? So our textbook reports that depending upon the data source, so once again, whether you're looking at official data from police reports or court cases, or whether you're looking at medical data or emergency room data, or whether you're looking at some of those sort of like victimization data sources that we've talked about previously. Depending upon the data sort, estimates range from only 7 to 50% of domestic assaults are actually reported to police. So we already, depending upon the source, understand that we have to take everything that we hear with a grain of salt, because until we get a better idea, especially with something that's such a sensitive topic as domestic violence, we know not every situation is going to end up with somebody going to the emergency room or seeking out medical assistance. Not every case is going to result in a 911 call to the police. And we'll talk about the reasons for that going forward. And then even when we have some of the other forms of data source, such as those confidential or anonymous victimization surveys, not everyone's going to report everything. And as we're going to continue to understand, sadly, victims don't always necessarily identify the abuse that they're suffering as actually being domestic violence. As we move a little bit further down this slide, we can look at findings from the National Crime Victimization Survey, which still showed that only about half of domestic violence, about 56% of domestic violence, is ever even reported to the police, which once again reminds us that we need to start finding out, how do we actually help victims if it's never being reported? And how can we find ways to improve the reporting numbers, not just to police, but to other agencies that may be able to provide assistance to victims? And then when we look at forms of intimate partner violence or domestic violence where the victim actually had significant injuries, we notice that only about 1 in every 3 cases actually receive medical care. So sadly, 2 out of 3 cases still appear that people will suffer through their injuries or will sort of, not necessarily lie, but maybe not tell the whole truth when trying to get any help for their injuries. So the variety of numbers that we see here shows us that we still don't have a perfect idea, like a perfect measure of the pulse in the sense of how much domestic violence is getting reported. But as we continue to improve our data sources, we're getting better and starting to get a better idea of it. And hopefully the gaps in reporting will help us to understand the best way to target and provide information to serve to victims who may be a little scared or trepidatious about reporting. So one of the things that's raised is, even in some of the highest numbers that we saw in that previous slide, was that roughly 1 out of every 2 cases of domestic violence are reported somewhere. So why don't victims report? What are some of the major causes? Because this starts to open up the door for us to explain and target some of these reasons why victims don't report. So we found research across the U.S. that finds that over 500,000 incidents go unreported each year. Well, what are the reasons? Well, recent data has identified some of the key reasons, and that's what we have listed down here, sort of the why. One is roughly 32% of the time, individuals say, I just want personal privacy. It's not a matter that should be taken care of outside of my own relationship or outside of my own home. And this is going to be one of the key things, especially as we look across different racial, culture, ethnic, and socioeconomic status lines of various victims and incidents of domestic violence. Is personal privacy is very important to people. And even though they may feel a victim, maybe they're scared, maybe they're embarrassed, maybe they feel that they're really at fault, they're guilty in some way, shape, or form. They don't want their laundry aired to the world, to the local law enforcement agencies, to medical professionals. They don't want their neighbors finding out. And so this is going to be one of our big sticking points. And you notice how high that percentage is. The desire for personal privacy is one of the biggest reasons why victims don't report, with 32% of the time. The second coming in there, as far as why people often don't report, is they're protecting the offender. Right? We think of domestic violence as this horrible thing, intimate partner violence as a negative thing. But in the course of an intimate relationship, or when you're working with close family members, even though that offender may be harming somebody, there's still love, there's still care. And so the victim oftentimes feels that even though that they are in a bad situation being victimized, they still want to sort of protect that offender. So another thing to think about, how do we encourage victims to speak out and yet still manage to find ways where they can be helped and assisted, and yet not necessarily sort of ruin their hope for protecting the actual offender? So how can we sort of have both things going on? Another major reason why people tend to not report is the feeling that the incident itself was relatively minor. And this also varies across age lines, family lines, culture lines, where what might be minor to one individual and what they've sort of seen and experienced in their life would be deemed a major event for somebody else. So this idea of trying to understand it from the eye of the beholder of what is minor, what necessitates actually reporting things. Fear of reprisal is also on this list. And this is one that we're going to see with some of the videos and other things that we're going to be looking at throughout this course, is sadly, many victims fear that even if they report it, that they're not going to get the immediate help from various agencies or law enforcement or the courts to still protect them from the backlash of their abuser. So fear of reprisal is still one of these big lack of reporting reasons. And then another sad thing is that even though it's the lowest on this particular list, it is still a significant number, where approximately 8% of people report that reporting it to the police is useless, because they feel that the police are either going to be inefficient in how they handle it, they're going to be biased. Victims fear that they're going to be labeled as the abuser. So there's a lot of moving parts going on here. As we look into why victims don't report, we can also start to look at another area to sort of introduce you to, is thinking about what is the type of relationship. And one of the things we want to think about is, because as I've stressed and will continue to stress, is each incident and each sort of case of domestic violence has many unique pieces to it. And as researchers, we do continually try to sort of create constructs or variables or typologize different types of offending, different types of abuse. But, and that's good because it also helps us to understand and categorize different types of abuse. But we also have to remember that each case has its own unique characteristics. And I know I sound like a broken record, and you've already heard that multiple times, but it is really important to take each case into account. So let's take a look at briefly using relationship status as a way to sort of show that how there's differences in the likelihood to report. So reasons that victims are less likely to report when they are the victim of an intimate partner, oftentimes, so you think an intimate partner, this is somebody that you have a close relationship with. Whether it's long term, whether it's married, maybe you share children. There is sort of been there should be some established trust in the sort of the sanctity of that partnership. So you think about this close relationship. Well, in some cases, the victim thought the incident was relatively minor, right? And you can imagine, especially in a long-term relationship, if the victim has already become sort of calloused or become used to the behavior of the aggressor over years or months or a long period of time, whatever happens in one particular incident may be minor through their eyes, and they may not even recognize it to be severe enough to need to report. Fear of reprisal, right? Obviously, in an intimate partner relationship, you may rely on the aggressor. The victim may be relying on the aggressor for housing, for financial assistance, for other things, for food, love, caring, safety, stability. And so even though they may be the aggressor, the victim fears a reprisal and doesn't want to have to report for fear of what could happen. And then also with intimate partners, there's often a sense where that's where we see that other one of the inefficient or biased police excuse coming out, where there's a sense of the idea that the police aren't going to help us because we're married or we're in a steady relationship, and they're not going to see it as being all that important. However, when we look at other types of relationships, so maybe like dating, minor relationships, or things where the people have not established what we would label as an intimate partner relationship, we see that the victim or the reasons for not reporting, two of the big ones are desire for personal privacy, right? So, this person's only been dating for a while. You're thinking, I don't want the world to hear about my bad issues within my dating life. Maybe once again, it's out of guilt. It's out of fear, but it's out of trying to protect their personal privacy. And then also we see the idea to try to protect the offender. The sense, well, maybe I don't know this person that well. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe, once again, it's a misunderstanding of what just happened to that victim. And therefore, they're thinking, I don't want to put this aggressor into the eyes of law enforcement because they may take it too far. So there's a lot of things going on that have to be taken out. So once an incident actually does get reported, what's the likelihood of law enforcement actually following through? And there's various levels of ways in which law enforcement can follow through with the report of domestic violence. So let's just sort of open that up, right? We think about the idea as we've been sort of starting this course is figuring like, well, what is domestic violence? Understanding the nuances from situation to situation. Then with this lecture, we're starting to talk about, well, why don't people actually report it, right? What is, and we've talked about a few reasons about why they may not choose to report it. And then for those who do choose to report it, do they actually get the outcome they hope? So let's take a quick look at some data and some numbers that have been reported to show what the police actually do. So in non-fatal incidents that have been reported to police, estimates are that about 3/4 of the time, the police will actually take a report. So the first step is you hope if a victim, if a bystander or the victim or a neighbor, whoever it is, happens to call 911 and report an incident to the police show up, you're hoping at a minimum they're going to take it seriously and file a report. Now we say, well, why don't we see 100%, number for them filing a report? There's many reasons that we'll go into in more detail later about why a report may not be filed. In some cases, maybe the police show up and both the victim and the perpetrator have disappeared. Or maybe they show up and both the victim and the perpetrator refuse to cooperate or to provide any information to the police. Maybe they show up and they feel that there's not enough evidence to even open or start any sort of report filing for a case. Now, a lot of scholars would argue that if law enforcement are called out for a domestic violence situation, at a minimum, there should be a report of what happened, of that actual incident recorded. And so we think that only 3 out of 4 times will there even be a report. Well, once a report is filed, what happens? So the next bullet point we see here is that the victim or another household member will sign a criminal complaint against an offender only about 50% of the time. So once again, in order for there to be punishment within the judicial system, obviously somebody has to be willing to allege a criminal complaint against the offender. And as you can see, that only happens about 50% of the time. And then we also see that when incidents are reported to the police, the offender is actually arrested or charges are filed only about 40% of the time. So that means that 3 out of every 5 reports to police are going to end up with not even ever having an offender arrested or charges filed. So you can imagine, and this is once again, don't think of it as saying that, oh, they're missing out, that just because the police are called out, that there has to be an incident worthy of a criminal complaint. That's not always the case. But when we look at how low some of these numbers are, especially as we move down this slide, we can see that there are things going on which may lead to the lack of law enforcement focus on actual incidents of domestic violence. So now let's move on to the idea of, does a victim even know that they are quote unquote a victim? And this is just one more thing that muddies the water when we try to study this phenomenon and get to the real answers and the real truth about what we're looking at. So we know that people tend to underreport or fail to report instances of domestic violence. We know that there's a sense of the rationales range from protecting themselves, protecting the offender, fear of reprisal, etc. We know that even when law enforcement are called out, it's not a slam dunk guarantee that there's going to be a police report filed or that charges are going to be filed against a potential offender. And then that just boils over into this idea of, well, how does a victim know that they're the victim? And more importantly, how do law enforcement officers, when they show up to the scene of a domestic violence call, how can they easily identify who is victim and who is perpetrator, right? If the case gets moved on to the courts, how does the prosecutor correctly identify who the victim and who the offender is? Oftentimes in a domestic violence situation, there is fighting on both sides, right? I mean, even victims do fight back and do try to defend themselves, which can also make it hard for everyone to sort of sort out the victim from the aggressor. So that leads us into this idea of context-specific definitions. So context-specific definitions is a very broad term for us making sure that whenever we define, say, domestic violence, or we define some sort of phenomenon, we have to look at the context in which that particular incident occurred. We started this course defining what domestic violence was, and we got a pretty broad idea of the types of things, sexual violence, physical violence, threatening, coercion, etc. Some of these terms, psychological abuse. And there is a clear-cut victim and there is a clear-cut perpetrator. So that sounds nice on paper from a research point of view. We have defined domestic violence and we have identified the perpetrator and we have identified the victim. Now let's go out and apply it to a real world situation. That's when things get hard, because in different contexts, identifying what exactly are the indicators of domestic violence may be harder than you would think. And also, identifying who the true victim is and who the true perpetrator is can also be harder than you might think. So, this is why when we look at context specific definitions, there's several things we always want to keep in mind when analyzing cases of domestic violence. One is the overall notion of what is the context of the incident? Is it a one-time deal, that event that took place in public? Did it take place at home behind closed doors? Is it something between a married couple? Is it between a dating couple? Is it between strangers who met on some dating app and are meeting up for the first time? Are there kids involved? Are there other family members involved? Is it a one-time deal, or has it been a long-term sort of situation? So all those things can sort of not only add nuance and understanding, but they also add some areas of uncertainty when we're trying to identify, is this domestic violence? Who is the perpetrator? Who is the victim, right? So those three key questions. Another thing is, like, who are the players involved? I mean, what I mean by the players is we're trying to identify the victim and the perpetrator and potentially any other third party individuals who are involved. So it makes a difference in the context. If both the victim and the offender are both male, if they're both female, if one's male, if one's female, if they're married, if they're not married, etc. If there's an age difference between the players, that can play into sort of this context-specific explanation of what we're trying to do. Also, we have to think about, once we have a particular case, who is the individual or individuals who are actually interpreting the incident in order to identify, is this a case of domestic violence? Who is the victim? Who is the perpetrator, right? So those sort of repeating thing. Is it the actual participants or the players that were involved trying to explain or define what's going on? Are we interpreting the incident by the letter of the law, right? Has the perpetrator's actions actually, achieved a certain threshold to make it a crime? Are these researchers who are collecting data to look for other more subtle indicators of domestic violence that may not even be quote unquote illegal? Is it the media trying to write a story and tell, then create, a background about what's going on? So all these things are going to change how we sort of define the incident, right? And remember, and I'll say it one last time on here, whenever we approach a case of domestic violence, we're sort of looking at three things in a very large sense. One is, what are the indicators or specific factors, measurable factors that say, yes, this is domestic violence? That's number one. And then number two, who in this particular case is the perpetrator, the bad person? And then finally, number three, who is the true victim in this case? And so all those things are not as easy to lay out and define as we look from one case to another. And then all of this kind of goes down when we think about context-specific definitions. At the bottom of this slide, we have to keep in mind what we call the spectrum of beliefs about domestic violence. And so once again, depending upon somebody's age, their background, their culture, their upbringing, the role that they play in society, their prior history of being in relationships with family members or other members of society, that changes our beliefs about what is domestic violence versus what is not. And when we look at the far right side where that arrow is pointing to, we see things like sexual violence and physical violence, right? Rape, sexual assault, hitting somebody to the point that there are bruises left, slapping somebody, using a weapon to cut or harm somebody. Most of us, no matter who you are going to probably agree that's violence, and if it's in that domestic situation, it is domestic violence. But as we move back towards the left, over towards where we see that psychological abuse and coercive control, historically, a lot of those things weren't necessarily defined as domestic violence. And this is going to be one more thing that we'll notice as we go forward that muddies the water, makes it hard for therapists, for people working, social workers, for police officers to identify the degree of domestic violence in certain cases, because something like psychological abuse or coercive control, which we're going to define in more detail in a bit, are one incident may not seem all that bad. And in fact, that one incident, there's a good chance that the behavior that the perpetrator engaged in is not even illegal. And so, can we define that as domestic violence? Well, as you're going to see, and as a lot of literature we're going to be looking at talks about, one of the things that has emerged over the last couple decades when we look at domestic violence is there is a pattern of behavior. It's not always one incident that really tells a story. There's usually more of, as I said, a pattern. There's a theme that it begins to emerge. And it's sort of the accumulation of all these little incidences that all of a sudden create a larger mosaic, a larger picture that when you step back and look at it, it's not just, oh, a little bit of aggression there, a little bit of jealousy over there, a little bit of wanting to know where their spouse is all the time over there. But once you step back and look at all these little pieces, it's like a mosaic. All of a sudden, that creates a much larger picture, which makes us realize, oh my goodness, this is a pattern of domestic violence. And that's what we're going to see sort of as being a key thing that's under this concept of coercive control. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that. Is it a crime? And hopefully for any of us who are taking a course like this and looking to whether to do research, whether to work as a social worker, whether to work with the courts, whether to work for a nonprofit agency, or whatever else it may be, even to assist a family member or a friend who may be suffering from something even closely resembling domestic violence. I think most of us will sit back and agree that nobody should ever feel abused or harmed, especially within a close personal relationship with another individual. But the bottom line, and we saw this in a previous slide, a lot of the push, especially in America, in order to legitimize domestic violence as a phenomenon worth focusing on, has really been sort of steered by the push for the criminalization of certain types of behavior. And the more that we criminalize certain types of behavior and outlaw them and identify them as a potential factor or a potential indicator of domestic violence, that criminalizes that behavior and also legitimizes our ability to understand it. But there are still a lot of things out there that are not technically a crime. So within that, there's sort of two major things that we're going to hear. So once again, more common terms are going to be coming up a lot. So psychological abuse, you're probably somewhat familiar with that. But another one is a term that is going to be seen and heard a lot throughout this course, and that is known as coercive control. And so what is psychological abuse, and more importantly, this notion of coercive control? And so I'll read this quote by Stark and Flitcraft from 1996. A pattern of coercion characterized by the use of threats, intimidation, isolation, and emotional abuse, as well as a pattern of control over sexuality and social life, including relationships with family and friends, material resources such as money, food, or transportation, and various facets of everyday life, such as coming and going, shopping, cleaning, and so forth. So what this gets at, and we're going to be diving much deeper into it, is it shows this notion of coercive control is clearly one of our largest sort of theoretical frameworks that has come about over the last couple decades to help us understand domestic violence. Because in a lot of relationships, you may have a situation where you have, say, a couple, and we'll say it's a man and a woman. Now, let's say that the woman doesn't like some of the people that the husband hangs out with. And the wife says, you know what? I'm not going to go out with you to certain events or go out to the bars or restaurants with you if these people are hanging out. So if you want to spend time with me, you can't hang out with them. Now, is that illegal for her to say that? No, it's not. But if that were to continue and move into other facets of their life where she's trying to isolate and remove her partner from having contact with other individuals in his life, that may start to be the first indicators of coercive control, right? I won't hang out with you, or I won't have sex with you if I know that you're hanging out with John and Joe and Bob, right? And we think of that. Same idea. Let's look at that same couple. Let's say that in this case, the woman is the breadwinner. She's the one who's got a great job making money. The husband is a stay-at-home husband or stay-at-home father. And as the woman is go out there and making a lot of money, she comes home and demands that if he's going to live in their house and stay with him or stay with her, that he needs to do the shopping. He needs to make sure everything's cleaned. He needs to make sure that the food is made every night and her dinner is served, right? That's controlling his life. And if she says, once again, I won't offer you money to spend on your hobbies or interests. I won't offer you certain pleasures of hanging out with me, or engaging in other sort of relationship aspects. Then she is starting to control his life because she has the upper hand. Now, in this situation, I painted it in a way where the female is the one sort of showing some indicators of coercive control. And I imagine most of you quickly realize that that's just as likely to happen in a male to female relationship, a female to male, a male to male, a female to female, etc., right? It can happen across different things. But this idea of coercive control is that it's not that they're doing anything overtly violent or criminal, right? They're not locking somebody up. And when they say, isolation or emotional abuse, they're not like they're like tying you to a chair at home and saying you're not allowed to leave the house because you're strapped to the chair. No, it's not even that far. Oftentimes it's because I'm not going to take you out to the movies tonight. I'm not going to buy you this new pair of shoes or clothing if you don't do X, Y, and Z. Or emotional abuse. If somebody in the relationship is saying, you know what, you really shouldn't wear that because it makes you look fat. It makes you look ugly. It makes you look like fill in some derogatory term, whatever it may be. Those in and of itself aren't criminal, but if a pattern starts to emerge, that may be indicators that there's something larger going on. And that's going to be one of the big important components of this concept of coercive control that we're going to want to dive into. So on here, on this slide, we look into a few more examples similar to what I sort of illustrated on the previous slide, right? Things like taking a partner's money or depriving them of money. If one partner happens to be the breadwinner and the other person has sort of agreed to take care of the household or other things within their relationship. Stalking a current or former partner. Now, obviously, there is criminal levels of stalking or following people, but just, if you were in a relationship for a long time and you had similar friend groups, you went to similar restaurants, you hung out at similar movie theaters or other coffee shops, and you just happen to continue to run into each other at those places after you've broken up, is that necessarily stalking? See, that's where the sort of the gray area comes into play. Surveillance of a partner. Once again, there are illegal forms of videotaping or watching somebody, but choosing to be in a public place and sort of watch somebody and see, I bet my former spouse or my former partner may go to this place if they're dating somebody. And if it's a public setting, is it illegal for me to just kind of happen to be in that same area and happen to see them and watch them? And then repeated rude remarks about a partner. At what point does somebody telling you, you look ugly when you wear that? Why did you do that? That's such a stupid thing to do. Or having these sort of negative comments, at what point do they start to become full-blown domestic violence? And once again, some people think about that context specific, depending upon who is interpreting the situation. There's going to be people from neighbors all the way up to the judge sitting in a court who are going to take different views on at what point does making rude remarks to a partner cross the line from simply being inappropriate and rude behavior to being criminal behavior that is worthy of punishment. And that's why at the end we finish off this slide with that in purple where it says, are these worthy of criminal sanctions? And I'm hoping one of the things we start to learn from this course is the importance of, when looking at a case, to every individual case of domestic violence, it's that mosaic. Take all the little broken pieces and start to put them together and see, once you step back, does that start to paint a clearer picture of a story of manipulation, control, and violence, that even the little broken pieces that we put together don't necessarily, each one of them may not tell the whole story, but the overall, the totality of circumstances do. So when we look at context-specific definitions and identifying the victim, your book, chapter 2, goes through and sort of breaks down various roles. And with this one, I just want to show, we're just going to focus on the role of gender real quick as we start to wrap up this particular presentation. And I'm going to show that the data kind of can, even if you are somebody who says, well, I'm going to trust the research, I'm going to trust the data, give me the facts and the facts will set you free type thing. Well, as you'll see on the next two slides, even when we look at the quote unquote facts about domestic violence and we look at the role of gender, at the role that gender plays, you can spin the story in either way, as far as who the victim is, who the perpetrator is, what the motivation for engaging in coercion or abuse or violence might be. So let's look at this role of gender. So research shows that women use violence as much as men. So even though we've started this course and we saw the numbers about the rates of domestic violence, and we saw that women, by and large, by most metrics that are out there, women are more likely to be the victims of domestic violence. And that's through both law enforcement reports, medical reports, and even victimization reports. But when you look closer at victimization reports, we show that women are just as prone to resort to violence as men are when there is some sort of conflict in their life. But yet, we notice that women comprise the vast majority of victims who seek outside assistance. And that might be a key thing, right? So even with this story, we say, well, why does that occur? Even though that women may be likely to use violence as much as men, why are they still the vast majority of victims? And the key phrase that we see towards the bottom of this slide is that comment where I say, who seek outside assistance? In some ways, there's still sort of stereotypes and fear of stigmatization within certain context-specific situations where we raise the question, are men fearful of speaking out because they're going to be seen as being an unworthy victim, right? Are they going to be laughed at? Is their masculinity going to be questioned? All things that sadly should not be going through the mind of somebody who knows that they're being coerced or abused or victimized. But sadly, we will hear reports going forward that maybe reason why we see differences in numbers of actual victimization is because of who is more willing to seek outside assistance. And that just is one of those reminders I'm going to come up. One of the things I think we can all sort of encourage for anyone who works in the area of domestic violence, especially if you're doing hands-on casework with individuals, both perpetrators and victims, the word vulnerability, being vulnerable is not a weakness. It opens your door to increasing your strength in many ways. And so I think one of our hopes is that get victims to be, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to open it up and tell your story. Even if you're going to have a few people who are going to victim shame you or say negative things, the healing and strength building only begins by being willing to open up. Looking a little bit deeper into the role of gender, once again, when we analyze responses and reports of domestic violence, two things that we see here, we see two contradictory statements that often come up when you have reports and interviews of victims of domestic violence. Women who often are engaged in domestic violence and then are labeled as the perpetrator or a aggressive victim often report that their acts are retaliatory, right? I was being beat, I was being abused, he was doing X, Y, and Z, and that's why I finally lost it and grabbed a knife or grabbed a baseball bat, whatever. and went after him. They report that their acts are retaliatory. But in a lot of those same studies, you'll have women or other victims who will report that it was deep down inside, even though they say that they acted out of self-defense or acted out of retaliation, they also report that there were seeds of jealousy, the desire to control the relationship, wanting deep down to punish their partner as their motivations, right? So that also shows a little bit of a proactive, aggressive nature, not just that retaliatory, reactive approach. And so trying to figure out, and as with most stories, there's probably a little bit of both, right? I mean, there's a little bit of that proactive, aggressive, I want to go out and stand up for myself, as well as the reactive, I must stand up for myself. I must do something now in order to survive. And we can see it's not always it's not a cut and dry situation. There's going to be a lot of areas of gray. And then finally, as we wrap up this particular lecture, we look at, and your book goes in once again into more detail about this, but you can see, as we just saw a few of sort of the ideas that come across. You look at reports and stories and numbers and information about the victim offender role. And you can imagine each dynamic adds a little bit more to the story. So the role of gender, we gave some examples. Same-sex domestic violence. We'll be diving into the difficulties in here as far as understanding who the victim is and who the perpetrator is. Sadly, it's whether it's the stigma of a male relationship where law enforcement may show up and say, well, how can I figure out the victim if you're both guys? And why don't you stand up for yourself? A lot of these really archaic things that need to be sort of put out of our minds, but sadly still exist. And for other times with same-sex domestic violence, the fear of reporting is, especially if the individuals in the relationship, if their sexual orientation is not known to family members or the public, they don't necessarily want to come forth with it in such an obvious and glaring fashion as a case of domestic violence. Age differentials, right? We can imagine the types of stigmas and assumptions that go into a relationship, especially if there are age disparities between the partners in that particular relationship. And do we assume that one's got more power, that is it always the older one that's going to have the strength and be the perpetrator? Or is there a point at which if somebody's too old, that a younger individual now has the power? So that throws a thing. Marital status, right? There are different levels of legal protection for people who are formally married versus people who are just cohabitating. And that can throw in different situations. Socioeconomic status. We'll be talking about levels of domestic violence, not just whether you're looking at lower, middle, or upper socioeconomic status couples, but also, once again, when there's a disparity between the two partners. Is one person the person who controls the financial strings? And especially for most of us, as we're looking around the world, money does matter. And so it does give you a sense of power. And does that all of a sudden change how we immediately identify the victim and the aggressor? And then obviously we also look at cultural variations, which go hand in hand with racial and ethnic differences as far as the culture that various people were brought up in. What is quote unquote the normal behavior for this group versus another group? And all these things add extra layers of detail and difficulty when trying to break down domestic violence. Okay, so there's a lot of sort of general overviews of what we're looking at, this idea of coercive control and context-specific definitions about domestic violence, all things that we're going to be delving much deeper into in the coming weeks. But for now, we will stop there. Take care.